Hello and welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring today's most pressing global issues into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. North Korea state media has remained silent about former U.S. President Donald Trump's election victory to secure a second term, with major outlets like KCNA and Rodong Sinmun not reporting on the outcome. In past elections, North Korea has typically covered U.S. results indirectly, but with a delay. For instance, after Barack Obama's victories, it published the results several days later, and after Trump's 2016 win, it took 11 days. Later, Kim Jong-un, who normally delivers a congratulatory message to his key allies after the election, has also remained silent. Now, instead, the regime has been focusing on jamming GPS signals off the coast of the Korean Peninsula for the fifth consecutive day, believed to be linked to the North's own training against drones. To better read into the reclusive regime's actions and the situation post-U.S. election, we're joined by Evan Revere, former acting U.S. Assistant Secretary of State and non-resident senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. Welcome to the program, Mr. Revere.
Great to be with you.
And we're also joined by Robert Kelly, Professor of International Relations at Busan National University. Thank you for joining us, Professor.
Hi, thank you for having me again.
So let's start with Mr. Revere. Despite Donald Trump's victory in the 2024 presidential election, North Korean media has remained silent, in stark contrast to previous U.S. elections when Pyongyang would typically report results within days. Why do you think there has been no reaction as of yet at this time, and what is North Korea's stance on Trump's victory?
Well, I can't help but wonder whether the leadership in North Korea was as shocked at the electoral outcome as many Americans were, and perhaps they're in the process of recalibrating their position and thinking about what to say and do, and probably thinking that they've stumbled upon an interesting bit of potential good fortune in this particular electoral outcome. But seriously, if my old colleague, Choi Sun-hee, who's now the North Korean foreign minister, were participating in this panel and you were to put that question to her, I dare say that her response would have been, we in the DPRK don't care about the outcome of the U.S. elections. We're going to do what we're going to do to protect our own interests, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is that North Korea does care very much about the outcome of this election and any U.S. presidential election. And in this particular case, and this gets to the second part of your question, I think the North Koreans are probably seeing that there may be an opportunity here to resuscitate direct contacts with the United States, particularly with Donald Trump, in the hope that they can pursue their agenda with the United States and with the Trump administration. That agenda, of course, has now changed. North Korea has made it very clear that there's no longer any question of their pursuing denuclearization. But their agenda does include a number of other important goals for them, not the least of which is the number one, which is to get either acceptance or acknowledgement of their status as a nuclear state. And then flowing from that, I think there's an interest perhaps in engaging the United States in a dialogue about arms control. Not that North Korea has any intention of allowing any controls to be put on its arms, but rather they want to get the United States to the table and get the United States locked into a dialogue about the issue of arms control, which would be, of course, one way of accepting or acknowledging North Korea as a nuclear power. But it would also, in the view of the North Koreans, get the United States to start putting some things on the table that the United States has not been previously willing to discuss, such as American deployments of tactical and strategic weapons aimed at defending and protecting the Republic of Korea. Beyond that, I think the North Koreans would like to be at the table to talk to the United States as one nuclear state with another. I use that phrase very carefully and advisedly because that's exactly what the North Korean foreign minister told us was one of the North Korean objectives several years ago. We would be prepared to talk to you as one nuclear state with another. And then, of course, the goal of that conversation would be to try to drive a wedge between the United States and the ROK, try to weaken the alliance, try to get the United States to put some restrictions on its own capabilities, and in doing so, strengthen North Korea's overall strategic position on the peninsula.
Right. So still, there's in North Korea's side, there could be an opportunity for dialogue with Trump's second reign. Now to Professor Kelly, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un often sends congratulatory messages to countries with strong ties to North Korea like China and Russia as soon as election results are announced. Now, given Kim's kind of personal relationship with Trump, is there a possibility he could personally congratulate Trump on his victory?
Yeah, I think that's probably actually being sorted right now, discussed right now internally in North Korea, right? I think actually the original comment there that maybe they're as surprised as we are, that might actually be correct, right? And that, I think a lot of people didn't anticipate this outcome, right? There's a sense, oh, he tried to overthrow the government in January 2021. He's not going to come back. America would never vote for that again. And now here we are with him back, and the North Koreans might be trying to figure this out, right? And what does this mean? Trump likes to say these leaders are his friends, but, Trump only met Kim Jong-un a few times. Is that really a friendship? Trump is also kind of an odd character, right? He tends to sort of go off script. He tends to wander and say all sorts of outlandish things. And so I would imagine that the North Koreans are sort of confronted with him once again. They're not really quite sure what to think. He talked big back in 2018 and 2019 about a breakthrough, but, he talked fearsomely the year before, fire and fury. So, if you're the North Koreans, you probably don't want to jump right into this thing. You kind of want to see where Trump is going to go. At the very least, you want to see maybe who he might appoint to some of these roles. So, for example, we just learned that Marco Rubio is the Secretary of State designate, right? Rubio's kind of a hawk. He probably wouldn't want negotiations with North Korea. So I would imagine, quite honestly, yeah, the North Koreans are a little bit surprised, and they are kind of pulling back and saying, let's just wait and see what happens. Let's see if Donald Trump goes on TV and talks about his friendship again. Does Trump even talk about Korea this time? He kind of got burned last time. He didn't get a whole lot out of his efforts with Kim Jong-un last time. Maybe he doesn't want to do that again. He wants to go and fix the Ukraine war or Gaza or something like that. So I imagine the North Koreans are they're probably just waiting to see what comes of the Trump team in the next, I don't know, month or so.
Right. Meanwhile, North Korea has continued its GPS jamming attacks off the coast of the Korean Peninsula for the 5th straight day, like I've said a while ago. Mr. Revere, first, why do you see North Korea choose these method of provocation among the various scenarios that were expected after the U.S. election?
Well, let's remember that North Korea has taken a number of actions in the run-up to the election designed to convey strength. And basically the message to Washington and to Seoul is don't mess with us. Don't take advantage of the fact that we're shipping so much ammunition, artillery shells, et cetera, to Russia. We're sending troops there. We haven't taken our eye off the ball here in Pyongyang. And so whether it's a new ICBM, whether it's visits to nuclear weapons facilities, whether it's strengthening of their defenses along the demilitarized zone, the North Koreans have taken a number of steps to show strength. And I think this particular thing that they're doing here has a couple of functions from the North Korean perspective, one of which is to once again demonstrate strength and demonstrate their capabilities, their ability to interrupt communications in a sensitive border area. But I think it's also part and parcel of the ongoing effort that Pyongyang is making to demonstrate its new approach to dealing with the South. It's more aggressive, it's more hostile, more confrontational approach in dealing with South Korea. And part of that approach, the North Koreans have made it very clear, clearer than ever, that they don't accept the Northern Limit Line, that they are resentful about the purported South Korean use of the offshore islands to launch some of those drones that went into North Korean airspace. And so this is part and parcel of North Korea's way of messaging Seoul, saying they're not happy and that they have mechanisms that can make the lives of the South Korean government and South Korean entities very, very difficult going forward.
Right, so they're sending these kinds of messages to South Korea. Professor Kelly, then what about for them? What's in for them from these actions, and how significant do you think economic benefits of the strategy might be for Pyongyang?
You mean the economic benefits of the GPS jamming?
Yes.
That's actually a really good question. I hadn't really thought about that. I'm assuming that the purpose of the GPS is to test out a new way to sort of provoke South Korea, right? This is a little bit something new, but of course the North Koreans have sort of a long history of provocations along the DMZ and the NLL. This is the Northern Limit Line. I mean, this is something that we know from sort of long-standing North Korean behavior is kind of common, especially around moments that are considered a juncture in South Korea and the United States around election time. You know, as was said just a moment ago, right, the North Koreans like to project strength. They have kind of a aggressive or offensively tinged understanding of deterrence, which means that sort of they don't just sort of like wait for the United States or South Korea to do an exercise or something like that. They aggressively kind of do these little provocations to kind of keep us on our toes and remind us not to mess with them, not to, you know, sort of push them too hard. And that's really how I read this. I'm not really sure that this is actually particularly meaningful, right? I think the Russians have been sort of experimenting with GPS jamming. Maybe this is a part of sort of like North Korean-Russian technological swaps. That's something we've been really worried about in the last 8 months or something like that. But yeah, I would imagine that this is sort of tied to the election, and it's basically sort of typical North Korean showing off or something like that, right? I mean, it doesn't really strike me as strategic. It strikes me as tactical, sort of provocative, the kind of stuff that the North Koreans done for a long time along the border.
Right, so more of a projection of power from North Korea.
Yeah.
Right. So this recent GPS jamming attacks appear kind of different from previous incidents, with reports indicating lower signal strength compared to earlier attacks in May and June. Professor Kelly, can we interpret this as a deliberate show of force, or is there another explanation for the reduced intensity?
Again, I just think I'm not really sure that I'll admit that's a little bit beyond my technical skills. My sense is that the North Koreans do these kinds of things that. My guess would be that they're testing, right? They're trying to sort of figure out what works and what does not, what's disruptive or not too disruptive. Remember, the North Koreans actually did anything that resulted in serious civilian death along the NLL, the DMZ, right? I mean, that would almost certainly provoke a South Korean response. That's what happened back in the small sea battles around Yeonpyeong back, 25 years ago. I mean, the North Koreans got to be real careful about that stuff because you don't want to provoke something, right? And this is something that we sort of learned with the Russians too, right? There's only kind of so far the Russians want to go in terms of the harassment of sort of like U.S. and NATO flying around NATO airspace, because if it actually leads to an incident or something like that, you just don't know how these states are going to respond. So I'd imagine that the North Koreans are probably calibrating and seeing this as a useful tool that can be used to harass South Korea, to get South Korea to shut down systems, to shut down aviation, navigation, or something like that, right? I mean, these kinds of things. That's the kind of experimentation, sort of learning that you would imagine the North Koreans are probably going through as they experiment with these asymmetric tools. And the North Koreans love that stuff, right? I mean, they love that kind of asymmetric stuff, right? Sort of like cyber, they love all that kind of stuff, hacking. This is really works well for them, right? Because it's really hard to put your fingers on it. It's really hard for us on the outside to say this specifically led to that, right? This is kind of like gray zone conflict, these sort of gray zone tactics where it's really difficult to nail down culpability and say A led to B because we're not really quite sure. And so this is the kind of thing I would imagine that South Korea will confront from North Korea for a while.
Right. Nothing that's really new from North Korea.
Certainly not the harassment.
Now, North Korea's nuclear capabilities continue to advance, and there has been growing debate, like our Mr. Revere mentioned a while ago, within the U.S. government about potentially recognizing North Korea as a nuclear state and pursuing arms control negotiations. Mr. Revere, how do you think Trump administration would handle this issue going forward?
Well, just to be clear, I don't know that there's anybody in the United States government making the case to formally recognize or accept North Korea as a nuclear weapons power. However, having said that, if there's an agreement or an understanding between Washington and Pyongyang to begin a dialogue about arms control, that has the effect of accepting the reality of North Korea as a nuclear power, because you don't have arms control talks with countries that don't have nuclear weapons, and you have to accept that fact. Having said that, I think going forward in the Trump administration, I think there might be interest in toying with this idea and maybe even moving forward with it about engaging North Korea in a dialogue that tries to address the issue of controlling the North Koreans' capabilities in the nuclear era. Let's remember that one of the key elements of the Trump approach with North Korea was creating what I call the appearance of successfully managing this issue. The reality was that the issue wasn't being very well managed at all. And so engaging in arms control talks with Pyongyang, in a sense, would be just the sort of political or diplomatic theater that Donald Trump likes and that he has engaged in the past. The reality, of course, is that from the North Korean perspective, the only arms that North Korea is interested in controlling are those tactical and strategic and other systems that the United States uses to defend and protect its South Korean ally. And so that would be a very sensitive area that I hope that people in Washington and the next administration would think very, very carefully about before going down that path, because once again, based on all of our experience over the decades with North Korea, we now know that North Korea's game plan all along has been to get and now to keep its nuclear weapons. So the idea of engaging in arms control, I think we would be deluding ourselves to think that that's successfully going to put a cap on what North Korea has spent so much time, so much energy, and so much money building.
Right, so we have to expect for a very cautious approach on that. Now, in another news today, North Korea has officially ratified its Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty with Russia just 2 days after Russian President Vladimir Putin also did so. So first, Mr. Reviewer, what does this mean, and how much significance would you put to this?
Well, the normal process when you have a treaty is to you not only sign the treaty, but to get it ratified and then have an exchange of we call it instruments of ratification, the documents between governments. That's what's taking place right now. The treaty was signed a number of months ago. It went through the legal and political procedures in both capitals. And now the instruments of ratification have been formally signed and are being exchanged, and that brings this agreement into effect. The timing is not accidental. You have thousands of North Korean troops who are amassing along with Russian troops in the Kursk area, prepared to conduct what seems to be a fairly significant offensive. And so now, I think, is the time for Moscow and Pyongyang to demonstrate that this is not just an idle piece of paper. This is a document that commits the two countries to work together, including in the military arena. And coming as this exchange of instruments of ratification does on the eve of what may be a major Russian-North Korean offensive, it's a demonstration that we're dealing with something substantial here. This relationship is significant. It has an important military dimension to it, and we are now going to see some aspects of that military dimension, including a possible joint offensive by the Russians and the North Koreans, and as Vladimir Putin hinted at a few days ago, the possibility of joint exercises between North Korean and Russian forces. So we're moving into this brave new world of Russian-North Korean military cooperation, and we are about to see whether it has teeth or not.
Right. What about you, Professor Kelly? Do you have anything to add on to that? What do you forecast about the relationship between the two countries?
Sure. Yeah, I think it looks like, I mean, we don't know because nobody ever tells us anything, certainly not from two autocracies like the Russians and the North Koreans, but it looks like this started off as sort of Russia in desperate need to raise troop strength to try to force some kind of outcome in Ukraine, right? I mean, Russia cannot mobilize internally because it has difficulty mobilizing ethnic Russians within Russia, and so that's why you've seen a lot of mercenaries and foreigners and prisoners and stuff like that, because Putin's trying to avoid mobilizing the Russian middle class. But because he can't do that, he can't generate the troop strength necessary to actually push this thing through to victory. Trump has opened up a window. Right now you've got and so has the arrival of the North Koreans. And so possibly Putin might be able to push for a real breakthrough, right? There's sort of a lot of conflicting information now about whether or not the Russians are actually culminating towards a breakthrough, right? But so I would imagine that that's sort of what the one purpose that the North Koreans are serving. Beyond that, though, yeah, I think the idea that the Russians and the North Koreans are increasingly working together, I think one of the undiscussed elements of that is that they're both trying to avoid dependence on China, right? If we're going to have this kind of axis of authoritarianism that people are talking about with Russia and North Korea, China and Iran, right? China is going to be the one that provides a lot of the cash to support the revisionist interests and efforts of those other three partners, right? But they don't want to be dependent on China. And so if the North Koreans and the Russians find their way to each other, right, and they can sort of pursue their goals without going to China and being dependent on so much on China, it actually works out rather well for the two of them. And I think that's been the sort of the big under-discussed thing here, right? Because we're all kind of looking at this idea of like, oh, well, these four countries are working together as a bloc. I would actually argue that what's going on is that both the Russians and the Chinese, or the North Koreans, are finding out they can talk to each other and kind of go around China, right? So they're not completely dependent on China to bail them out of their various geopolitical problems.
Right, but we've heard that North Korean airmen who survived the Vietnam War have been hailed as heroes in the regime, and there's been news reports that North Korean soldiers might be wanting to volunteer to participate in the war because of that kind of reasons. So if they do want to volunteer more on that, what kind of scenario could we expect, Mr. Revere?
Well, I doubt anybody is calling for volunteers in Pyongyang to go fight in this particular front. I think the orders have come down from on high that you will go and you will do A, B, and C in support of our Russian partners. North Korean troops, we know, are trained to fight for the leader. They're trained to fight for the party. They're trained to fight for the country in roughly that order. So it raises an interesting question about what is the regime doing to motivate their troops, their forces, as they go into battle, fighting on foreign soil for a foreign power and fighting against an enemy that they know very little about. This raises all kinds of interesting questions about how reliable the North Korean troops, who they may be very well trained. They're certainly tough as nails. We know that from personal experience. But these are unusual conditions and an unusual environment that they're fighting in. This is the first time North Korean ground combat troops have been deployed overseas ever. And so this raises an interesting question of what the regime is going to do to make sure that the level of fervor and the motivational level of these troops remains high. And I think it's uncertain, but we'll find out as soon as the rubber hits the road, and as soon as these troops come under intense and heavy fire and in real combat conditions, and they're bloodied, how motivated they are to do what the regime has asked them to do.
Right, so we'll have to see how the situation develops over there. Mr. Revere and Professor Kelly, thank you so much for your time and sharing for your insights tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.